Hello and welcome to Crosspoint Church's podcast, Behind the Point. My name is Adam Robertson. Today joining me is Neal Crum. Now, Neal, can you tell us a little bit about where you pastor and what life is like for you now?
Pastor at Sandy General Baptist Church. Been pastor there for 18 years, coming up in a few months. And truly, we enjoy that, love the people there. Married and have two kids, grown up, and both of those married now.
Now, I've known you for many years. And as far back as I remember, you've been a pastor and you've been a leader in many other, church-oriented things. However, I'm sure that's not exactly where you started. So I'm curious, what was your salvation story like? How did God get a hold of you?
Wow, that's a big... How much time do we have?
Oh, we got all the time we need.
Good. So, I grew up in a Christian home, and so I had a good foundation from my parents and that, and I am forever grateful for that heritage and having that passed down to. My grandpa was a pastor, or a preacher. He wasn't a pastor, but he was a tent revivalist, and he came out here and did that for years. And so I grew up listening to him and having him teach. But then coming through that, sometime when I was in my mid-teens, and looking back at it now, I was 15 years old, in a youth group in a large church in Springfield, having a youth service on a Saturday night. I was at the altar praying. My youth pastor came over and prayed over me. And the prayer that he prayed for me, I've never forgotten this part of it. It scared me then, still scares me now. Yeah. And he prayed over me for me to be a leader of men as Moses was. And I really feel like, way too big. Way too big. Things didn't really happen at that point. I was 15. A few years after that, I hit some of those teenage years where I went off doing my own thing.
Now, whenever you were young and you gave your life to Christ, was that something that you felt like was a moment where you had that realization, or do you feel like that's something that you grew up with and you just knew that Christ was your Savior?
Yeah, both of those. We were having a vacation Bible school where we went to church, and I was about 5 years old and went forward at that time and wanted to be baptized and was baptized then in my green plaid pants. And so that was my first experience. For the most part, I stayed pretty strong in my faith until maybe the last couple of years of high school. And then during that time, a little bit of independence, and started running a ways. I pretty much was out of church, and it would be during that time that I would meet my wife, who I have today, and it would be after meeting her and after getting married that there would be a life-changing event for both of us.
Now, when you were away from God and you said that you had that distance, I'm curious, in a Christian home, did you feel that conviction? Did you feel that pulling toward God?
I did, sure. I think I always felt that conviction, always knew what was right and what was wrong, always knew where I needed to be. And so that was always there. And I'm glad that it was, because it brought me back. I could go to church and be there and do all the things that you do at church. I knew how to be a Christian. I knew how to act like a Christian and such. So I could do that. But it would certainly change when I would meet my wife and she would take me to the church that we now pastor.
What was that like whenever you decided to get right with God?
I had met my wife the summer after I graduated school. Met her in Branson at the time when all of the kids would cruise the Strip, and that's where we were at. It was on the Strip, and met her there. Within a few months after meeting her, we found out that she was pregnant. Within a few months after her getting pregnant, we got married. From getting married in February to our oldest daughter being born at the end of May, at that time when she was giving birth, we were premature, about 8 weeks, and she's bleeding very badly, Leanne was. Go to the hospital and find out that there's been a major problem, and a lot of blood has been lost, and the doctors tell us that tell me that likely to lose the baby and could lose Leanne. At that point, the nurses take Leanne away, and I'm led away to a waiting room where there's nobody else at. I'm alone in that waiting room without any contact with anybody, not knowing what's going on. My parents are on a vacation in Hawaii. I call my grandma, let her know that we're at the hospital. And so I know that they're coming and letting her parents know. And while I'm there in that waiting room, it's then at that point that I begin to pray and realize that the only answer that I have for myself and the only hope that there is for my wife and for my child is to call upon the God of my childhood. And so I do that, and later would find out that my wife does the same thing while she's awaiting the birth of our child. Ashton was born that night within 30 minutes of us arriving at the hospital. We were told that she would need to be taken to St. Louis, to where they would be able to take care of her. But when she was born, she started breathing on her own. She was very small, under 5 pounds, but she was perfect, nothing wrong with her. And so that was a miracle. Leanne had lost a lot of blood, and so it took her a while to recover from that. But within a week, we were able to go home as a family with our child. Miracle that God gave us, and that would begin to set us on a new path from where it is that we found each other. Both of us running from God, and now we're beginning a journey together as a family running back to God.
So you're coming back from the hospital, and if you were to kind of go over what your thoughts were at the time.
I don't know that I had any high feelings of a great calling on my life or anything right at that moment. It's just a matter of wanting to go home and be a godly father and husband, to be what it is that my parents had modeled to me and what it is that I knew God wanted me to be, so that our family would be a home of peace and one that God could work in.
You realize that God's there, and God has his hand in you, not just you, but your family. And you have this calling, but how did you make the adjustments? How did you make changes? How did you start seeking after God? Because there had to be some kind of lifestyle change. There had to be some kind of, going to church and just going through the actions to actually commitment. What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a commitment to church. And so my family went to a church in Forsyth at that time, and of course there was Sandy, where her family was going to church, and so on the weekends we would be going to church there with them, and we were living in Forsyth, and during the midweek we'd be going to church in Forsyth, where my family went to church, and just begin on this road of making a commitment again in our lives to follow God and to allow Him to change our lives and lead us in the direction that He would want us to go at that time, not necessarily knowing where that would be.
There's a change with you, but did you see anything after those weeks with Leanne as well, and how you two were seeking after God as a couple?
Yes, absolutely. It would be shortly after that she began to look at what God was wanting to do in her life, and as you mentioned, the music. I mean, within a short period of time after that, she started getting involved again with the music and music ministry and what it is that God would want her to do, and within a very short period of time was back into a Southern gospel group, and that drug us back into traveling every weekend with different churches all over the state.
And so how did you begin to have a calling on your life?
Yeah, that's tied right back into the music ministry with her. After we had done that for a couple of years, our Gary Moore, our bass singer, was there, and we started going to church, and every weekend, every church, no matter where we were, at the end of the service, he was standing up and he was saying, "Somebody here is being called into the ministry." It's like every weekend he's doing that. It's like, come on,
Yeah.
Gary, you really think that somebody in every one of these churches is called to the ministry? And finally, after hearing that for so long, one night back at Sandy Church, we were having a candlelight service on a New Year's Eve, and I stood up in front of the church, and unbeknownst to anybody, hadn't discussed this with my wife or anybody else. I stood up and asked them to pray for me as I entered into the ministry.
So is it something that you felt led to, but then it took a while for God to actually start using you, or was it something where you just you didn't know what was going on, but God immediately started doing something?
Yeah, he immediately started doing something. I didn't know I was going to say that night when I stood up in front of the church. Had no idea, but that's what came out. And from there, God started moving me in a direction. And I don't remember the exact, but within a month or so after that, I preached my first message. Studied and had notes upon notes upon notes upon notes. Took about 5 minutes for me to preach that first message. It was great. Study to show thyself approved out of Timothy was my text. And from there, I was preaching constantly. It seemed like it, whether it was at Sandy on Sunday nights and working with the youth there, serving as interim pastor at other churches and filling in for pastors and the leadership in the church. At that time, our senior deacon was Bob Seiler, who has since passed on, and he was quick to grab a hold of me and to make sure that I was plugged in where I needed to get the training that I needed through our churches and through our association, and started me on that road. And they made sure I had opportunities then to preach there at the church and to work and to aid me with whatever help I needed with that.
And so as you go through and you're preaching at these other places, before you actually take a church, what was that period like? Do you feel like you were, always just call and led, or did you have moments where you wondered, God, what are you doing here? Am I doing something else?
Yeah, there was times I wondered what he was doing, wondering what direction he was taking us. I remember Leanne, she gave me a Bible when we first started in the ministry, and in the front of it, she wrote something to the effect of wherever it is that God takes us, I'll go with you. And that was a big deal for her because she was afraid that, I don't know if afraid or fear is the right thing, but she was worried that God would take us across the world. And she had to come to the place of saying, yes, I'll do that. But then after all of that's said and done, God placed us right back in her home church as pastors eventually, where our grandchild now is sixth generation in that church.
So what was it like when you took your first church?
Oh, my. First, Sandy Church would be the first one that I was actually full-time, as pastor at. Before that, I spent about a year as interim pastor in Powersite at the community church down there, filling in for them. And, those first years doing those things, all I can say is I look back and the congregations at both of those places were very gracious, for us with a young minister and a young family. And as we moved in, I'm certain that we made lots of mistakes on our own with the people, but I'm so thankful for those people. I'm so thankful for the people at Sandy Church in those early years as they helped to, because they really did. They trained up a pastor.
Now, whenever I've talked with other ministers, they usually have about that same kind of story where their first sermon, they got real prepared, and it was just 5 minutes. And then they started trying to get into church and starting to minister, and they felt like they really needed the help of the church to just kind of stay afloat. And do you have any examples of what it was like when you were first starting in ministry and you maybe just first took the church, of other people coming alongside you and supporting you?
During those, when we started going to church there, Frances Humbert was the pastor when I came into the church, those first years. And that was before I was saved. Leanne drugged me in there. And so she was the pastor there. The previous pastor before her, who was Floyd Roberts, was going to church there as well. And so then as I would take the position of pastor there, not only was it myself, but I also had our two previous pastors both still there at church, both Francis, both Floyd. So they were always right there with me and praying, praying with us, praying for us, and encouraging us along the way. I think that was probably a very unique position, one that most pastors don't find themselves in. And so here I had these two, to me, great people of faith that were always there. Floyd did our wedding when we got married, and of course we miss him greatly. Francis is still there at the church with us and prays with me every Sunday morning before I preach. And so I'm so thankful for that.
Did you find it challenging, nerve-wracking preaching in front of them, or did you find it comforting?
Both. Yeah. I still find myself nervous and when I'm preaching before other pastors. Yeah, and especially more so in the early years. No, sure. Watching for their expressions to see if they approved of what I was saying or wasn't saying, to make sure that I was going in the right direction and saying what I was supposed to be doing. And Leona Comer was the one that I'd always look to make sure that I was stopping on time, because she would look at my watch if it started getting close to quitting time. And so, I appreciate those people. The one major milestone would be that of when we took Sandy Church as pastors, of changing from traveling and settling down in one place. Next big milestone, I think, would be changing jobs so that we would be able to focus more on ministry and going that. And that was scary to begin to move away from a place of having the financial stability of a full-time job to depending more upon that. And then times of looking at mission work and doing that and seeing God's calling as well, and what it is that He has done in the past and what it is that He still is going to do in the future concerning mission work for us.
Kind of traveling off into the mission work, one of the places that you and I see each other almost about every year is over at camp. You guys do a different age group than I do, but nonetheless, you guys have directed camp for many years, and you guys have been involved in working with the communities and making sure that Christ's name is something that is well known within the community. I'm curious, how did you get started over at White River Youth Camp?
We've been working at White River Youth Camp since mid to late 90s. We got called there right after, not too long after I started preaching. They called me down there to be the camp evangelist. And so that's my first introduction. And of course, Leanne grew up at White River Youth Camp as a camper and as a counselor. And so she was familiar with it already. It was all new to me. But that was my first experience, getting called in as camp evangelist, coming in just on nights and doing that, and then eventually coming and staying through the week as evangelist, and then working as a counselor and until I eventually would move into director for our age group of camps. And we've been there for over 20 years at White River Youth Camp, and that is a ministry that is close to our hearts. It's one of the biggest things that we get involved in and do, as far as the number of lives that we can touch all at one time, to be able to touch the kids of our communities, and kids from all over the state of Missouri and outside of the state of Missouri come in, and it's a tremendous opportunity.
It is. It's incredible. And you guys do, such amazing work with your guys' camp. Kids will remember. They will remember that somebody loved on them and invested in them. And it's one of those things that they'll carry with them. Do you have any promises that you've held on to? Other pastors have said that they have a life verse that they just always return back to. Always, is there something that God spoke with your life or has led you that you just hold on to?
Yeah, I do have a life verse. It's a verse that the church where we pastor knows very well. I find every opportunity that I can to remind them of it. It's Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. And it just reminds me that no matter where I am in life, no matter what our needs are in life, that if I'll seek after God first, put Him first, He'll put everything else in order in our lives. When I set Him as my first priority, He then in turn will set all the priorities in my life where they need to be. I can look back at my life during that time when I wasn't putting God first, and I can see what it was doing to my life. I can see the consequences that it brought to me and to those that were around me. And I can see the difference in my life and my family and my kids when I would seek after God and put Him first in my life, how it is that God, time and time again, has provided for us.
We're running out of time, but I want to end with one more note. If someone's listening to this, they've heard your story and they've heard about how you put God first and He began to lead you and you just took step after step after step and you are where you're at today. But maybe someone's looking and they're like, well, I go through the actions. I know how to play church. Maybe afraid of making that commitment, or they're not sure how to get started with that. Do you have anything that you would say to them to encourage them?
Yeah, I think all of us probably feel that to some degree, the inadequacy, not knowing where to start or how to do it. We're not able, we're not worthy. And that's the case for every one of us. There's not a one of us that's worthy. There's not one of us that has the abilities to do it. And that's what walking in faith is all about. Walking in faith, trusting God, knowing that He's the one that's able. He's the one that's able to provide for us in our lives. And I'm not worthy, and it's because of that He died on the cross for me that I could be saved. He's able to deliver us. He's able to lift us up. He's able to set us on a straight path, and He's able to provide for us everything that we need in life for us and for the journey that He sets us on and what His expected end is for us.
That's excellent. Well, Neal, I want to thank you for joining me today, and that is all the time we have. If you've been listening to this podcast, then I encourage you to check out our other content. We have CPC Minutes that are uploaded Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We also have other messages from Sardis Church, so make sure to check that out, and also check out our Instagram and our Facebook page. And Neal, thank you again for joining me, and all who's been listening, you've been listening to Behind the Point. My name is Adam Robertson, and until next time, God bless.